Good evening and welcome everybody on behalf of Learners to tonight's webinar. My name is Richard Newton-Chance and I'm the Chair of Learners Council. Learners is dedicated to connecting educators and world-leading scientists who specialise in the study of the brain, the mind and behaviour in order to use the evidence and insights from high-quality research in these multidisciplinary fields to improve and enrich teaching and learning for all. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ben Williamson, who will be delivering tonight's webinar. Ben Williamson is a senior lecturer and co-director of the Centre for Research in Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh. He is an editor of the journal Learning, Media and Technology and is currently collaborating on the ESRC-funded Centre for Socio-Digital Futures. Ben and colleagues recently completed a research project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, investigating how data-intensive biological sciences, especially genomics and neuroscience, are impacting on education. He's going to share findings from that project during this webinar. Tonight's lecture is entitled Educational Neuroscience, Neurotechnology, and the Translation of Learning Brains into Policy and Practice. Please switch your microphones and cameras off during the lecture. Please post any questions you may have using the chat facility in Zoom, and we will pick them up at the end of the talk. The video of the lecture, together with any slides, will be posted on the Learners website in the next few days. Please do subscribe to the Learners YouTube channel, where this lecture and all our previous webinars are available. Now, I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Williamson for tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Very much, Richard. I hope you can see the slides which I've just started sharing. So I really thank Learners for the invitation to talk to you this afternoon. I think I may be a bit of an unusual guest on this webinar series. I'm not a brain or a cognitive scientist. I'm an educational researcher, and I work from a social scientific perspective on how digital technologies and digital data are impacting on education in a number of ways. And I suppose the background to this talk is that a few years ago, I became particularly interested in how the genetic and the brain sciences had started really collecting large amounts of data relevant to education and learning through advanced new technologies. So what I want to do today is talk about how neurotechnologies or brain technologies are being used to generate digital data about what we often call the learning brain, and how that data is becoming the basis for proposals around educational policy or practice in classrooms. And what I really hope is that bringing some social scientific perspective in might help to sort of kickstart some conversations across both the social and the neurosciences about the role and impact of these powerful new technologies in educational research, but also in our teaching systems. Now, just to set the scene a little, as I'm sure many of you heard, last year, some researchers at MIT carried out a study on the effects of ChatGPT, the AI application, on students' brains. And they claimed to use electroencephalography, EEG, to assess cognitive load during essay writing. And they equipped all of the students in the study with a head-worn, a neuro headset to collect the EEG data. And they said the EEG revealed significant differences in brain connectivity, highlighting potential cognitive costs at neural, linguistic, and behavioral levels. Now, my interest is not whether ChatGPT actually affects students' brains, but rather to see this study and the reception it got, because it got a lot of media attention, to see this study and that reception as exemplifying how the brain of the student has become an object of growing public and media concern, as well as an object of increasing scientific attention. Now, this isn't, of course, completely new, as the historians Vidal and Ortega argued in their book, Being Brains. The origins of a neuroscience of learning actually lie at least in 19th century ideas about the brain as a kind of muscle mixed with Victorian moral anxieties about the brain's fitness for a virtuous life. And as the image indicates, towards the end of the 20th century, there was already burgeoning interest in scanning the brains of children and learners through advanced laboratory technologies. But what that ChatGPT study indicates, I think, is that this kind of research has now moved out of the kind of, the lab with the big equipment and become something that's much more routinized, can take place in classroom settings themselves, and can generate significant impacts on the public understanding of the student brain or the learning brain. Now, this current growth of education relevant brain science is at least partly the result of advances in what we call neurotechnologies. A neurotech is simultaneously a set of advanced devices for scientific use, sort of instruments for scientists to use in their studies, but it's also a commercial industry, and it's also the subject of considerable anxiety over neural rights and ethics and regulation. And just to give you one example, the commercial neurotech company Muse sort of indicates that there's this growing industry of devices that are now being marketed with claims about brain training. So they suggest at Muse that, if you can read the small text, you can increase your cognitive endurance and strength through neural tracking that reveals how hard your brain is working. You can, they say, strengthen mental stamina and reduce cognitive fatigue. And they say you can sharpen your attention to stay locked in through EEG-powered real-time neurofeedback that helps you train and sustain focus. So the promise here seems to be of kind of making the inner workings of the mind measurable and visible in kind of these digital visualized readouts, and then producing actionable neurofeedback for personalized training or the optimization of mental and cognitive function. So the model here seems to be, it looks like wearing a Fitbit on your head, and it's almost like those Victorian phrenologists have ended up in Silicon Valley working on these kind of neurofitness apps for stressed out students. Now, in educational neuroscience research, the claims are obviously much less spectacular, but neurotechnologies have still been positioned as being really quite key to generating insights into the inbrained aspects of learning. So as this very recent review article indicates, there are at least 5 different kinds of applications of neurotech in recent research. They include digital brain measurement, neurofeedback, brain stimulation, brain activity monitoring and regulation, and AI-based prediction. So it seems then that through these kinds of neurotechnologies, the learning brain has been kind of rendered visible in digital data formats in ways that it just simply couldn't be seen before. And this kind of visibility of the brain through neurotechnology also appears to promise the possibility of acting on the brain too. And it's that means that neuroscience is gaining significantly more kind of authority and significance as a source of knowledge about education, with strong claims of its relevance for policy and practice. Now, as I said, I come from a more social scientific background, and the way that colleagues and I have engaged with educational neuroscience and neurotech is then based primarily on social scientific and philosophical research into the practices and the technologies that are involved in sort of producing knowledge about the brain. And to try to just give you a very sort of brief and simple overview of some of this work. Social scientists and philosophers often treat neuroscience as a social process that involves scientists and institutions and technologies, and it involves laboratories and instruments, and it involves theories, models, and knowledge. And all of those things are involved in the social work that produces neuroscientific knowledge. It's the same as all kinds of science. All kinds of science are a kind of work and a set of social practices. That's why social scientists like kind of studying the processes and practices of science in the making. And then neuroscience, as a particularly high-tech domain of science, involves a lot of technologies that often require the reduction and the simplification of complex neural phenomena. Now, of course, the brain is just an extraordinarily complex object. So neuroscientists need to find ways of kind of, sort of taming it in a way to comprehend it. So as the philosopher Masvita Shirimutta has put it in a recent book, knowledge of the brain is to some extent generated by the process of investigation, which employs simplifying strategies such as use of controlled experimental conditions and idealization in modeling. And the sociologist Victoria Pitts-Taylor makes a similar argument that the choice of scientific procedures and instruments and technologies leads neuroscientists to uncover very different understandings of what a brain is and what it does. So how you choose the instruments with which to study some aspect of the brain or the learning brain, what models you adopt, what data analysis procedures are followed, what software is chosen for analysis and how it's set up, what it visualizes, all of these things from a social scientific perspective mediate and shape what becomes visible to the scientist. So in that sense, neurotechnology sort of takes part in changing how neuroscience itself understands the brain. And of course, neuroscience isn't just a scientific endeavor. Particularly over the last 2 decades, neuroscience has become a source of knowledge that policymakers and governments increasingly draw on. So as Jessica Pikett has argued, what she calls brain knowledge produced by neuroscientists has begun informing policy developments across a whole range of domains, including law, social work, mental health, children's care, and education, of course. And sociologists Nicholas Rose and Joel Abi Rashid call this governing through the brain. So what they mean is deploying neuroscientific knowledge, not only in healthcare, but across this whole range of sectors. So it's this kind of work that's informed our project, where we were particularly interested in how neurotechnologies are being used by neuroscientists to investigate and create knowledge about learning brains, and in how the knowledge so produced then supports aims to kind of govern or sort of manage and inform how we go about educating children in schools. So in the rest of this talk, I want to talk about 2 kinds of what I call translation in educational neuroscience. And the first of those translations is the translation of the wet brain, the embodied biological substance that exists inside of our skulls, into dry brain data via neurotechnologies. In other words, the kind of computer information that is held in databases. And the second translation is of the neuroscientific findings based on those data into proposals for sort of brain-based or brain-informed interventions in education policy and or practice. And the simple argument, or I think it's a simple argument that I'm trying to make, is that the adoption of neurotechnologies has enabled educational neuroscience to advance its claims of policy relevance in the field of education. And the result of that is that just at the moment, educational neuroscience appears, particularly in the UK, to be on the cusp of becoming, quite a significant influence on educational practice in schools. The learning brain has become a serious object of policy attention, thanks to the way it's been made visible through neurotechnologies in ways that it wasn't made visible before. Now, just quickly before I go on to the next section of the talk, I just want to acknowledge that everything I'm saying today is based on a research project led by myself that also involved my colleagues Dimitra Katuza, Jessica Pikett and Martin Pickersgill. The talk today wouldn't be possible without their collaboration over the last few years. And I need to just acknowledge the funding awarded by the Leverhulme Trust for our project. And in the two papers, both of which we published quite recently, that I'm drawing on, we studied over 100 educational neuroscience research articles, trying to understand what these articles say, what's the state of the art in terms of the science in educational neuroscience. And we also studied 20 video recorded conference and seminar talks that were available online, where neuroscientists speak slightly more publicly about the kind of the implications and the importance of their work. And it was through both of those sources that we were trying to unpack how is neurotech being used, what kinds of new insights are being claimed, and what kinds of proposals are being made for the implications of that for either classroom practice or some kind of policy intervention. Okay, so in this part on kind of the first set of translations, I want to trace some of the ways that this idea of the learning brain has been studied in educational neuroscience. And my approach here specifically is informed by those kinds of sociological accounts that have aimed to unpack the particular kind of laboratory setups of methods and technologies through which the contemporary truths of neuroscience have been generated. So from this perspective, the knowledge of neuroscience it doesn't constitute a kind of straightforward set of representations of the kind of underlying neurobiological reality, but instead need to be understood as products of a kind of a vast number of contributing factors co-produced by a collection of circumstances, social interests and institutions, methodologies and technologies. So there's a whole bunch of kind of social, technical factors that are involved in the production of what Slaby and Chowdhury there call brain facts. And I suppose most importantly for us, these kinds of knowledge claims, brain facts, truths, lead then to particular kinds of ideas of proposals for intervention. And we're using the term neurogovernance, drawing on some of the other sociological literature, which refers to the way in which neuroscientific knowledge can be used to designate an appropriate course of action or a mode of managing particularly education in this context. Now, this probably sounds a bit more sinister than it is, this term neurogovernance, but really it just simply designates the role of neuroscientific knowledge and expertise in determining any given kind of pedagogical approach. And just to give one very, very brief example, we might think of the fairly recent introduction of cognitive load theory into classroom practice in England as an example of neurogovernance that's already in action. The kind of the use of brain science knowledge about working memory as the basis for designating what good kind of teaching should be. I'm just going to skip this in the interest of time, but it just simply points out really that there's a kind of a long history to efforts to use neurotechnologies in education. The OECD, UNESCO, and so on have sort of been promoting the idea that you can use MRI, fMRI, EEG to image the brain and gather new insights into the brain. This is all part of what the OECD is called a kind of new learning science. Ultimately, what we've suggested is that what's going on through neurotechnologies is a kind of informationalization of the learning brain. The learning brain's being rendered as digital information so that it can be studied through the use of computers. And to illustrate that, I just want to briefly describe 4 examples that we studied in one of the papers. So the first example is that of the plastic brain. And as many of you probably already know, neuroplasticity as a concept describes how the brain is affected by learning, experience, environmental stimuli, and interactions. And it's really opened the door to the idea that the brain can actually be kind of materially reshaped for improved learning. The neurotechnologies that are required to study neuroplasticity include magnetic resonance imaging and functional MRI for sort of neuroimaging. And through those technologies, it's been possible to detect brain structures and functional changes over time at fine-grained neuromolecular resolution. So from this perspective, learning is understood as molecular changes at the sort of neurobiological level itself. So as one prominent educational neuroscientist has put it, teachers rewire and restructure the brains of others in ways that can be as biological and ultimately life-changing as the effects of neurosurgery. So plasticity functions, as something of an enabling concept for educational neuroscience. It denotes the materiality and the specificity of learning and teacher in terms of brain processes. But plasticity as a concept is also, it's been argued, kind of open-ended enough to encompass and reflect a whole range of values, hopes, and anxieties about the character and futures of children and youth. And one example of this sort of merging of biological knowledge about plasticity with social values and anxieties is what is sometimes called neuroscience of socio-economic inequality studies. And these kinds of studies use neurotechnologies to measure and model the effects of social deprivation on neurobiological matter. So these kinds of studies tend to see the brain as kind of materially imprinted by socioeconomic disadvantage. The findings show that children from poorer backgrounds experience underdevelopment in certain brain regions that affect learning-related brain functions. Now, this is what's known as a biosocial effect, as the plastic brain structures are imprinted by social factors from the external world. And a particular response to this then is the designation of particular kinds of pedagogic interventions, such as targeted early years literacy and numeracy programs that are reported to have measurably ameliorative effects on brain development. So given that we're kind of sort of approaching some of this through the idea of neurogovernance, the mobilization of neuroscientific knowledge to inform ways in which we go about governing and managing classrooms, then we've been referring to some of this work on plasticity as biosocial neurogovernance. That is, these are attempts to intervene in this biosocially affected brain based on measurable signatures of poverty, and then to address social inequalities through acting on the plasticity of the brain itself. Now, the second variety of neurotech research that I want to bring up is hyperscanning. So these kinds of studies investigate dynamic social exchanges and continuous interactions amongst students and between students and teachers. And the idea is that you can have multiple people in the same classroom wearing wearable neuro headsets capturing EEG or fNIRS data. And the idea is that this would collect real-time, real-world synchronized data as a single data stream for analysis. So this is about making the kind of the neural correlates of social learning visible, and the concepts that are used sort of include brain-to-brain coupling and cross-brain correlations and inter-brain cognition and so on. Now, this kind of inter-brain synchrony, it's been claimed, is not only associated with, but also predictive of learning outcomes. So hyperscanning then is kind of positioned as a potentially valuable way of determining effective pedagogies. The idea is if you can isolate which kind of classroom practices stimulate brain synchrony, then maybe you could scale up those kinds of practices to activate improved learning in other classrooms. So we've called these kind of hyperscanning proposals inter-brain neurogovernance. And by this we mean that this knowledge of neural synchrony that's detected with wearable neurotechnologies could be used as the basis for redesigning pedagogic activities that might lead to better brain activation amongst students. In a third case, educational neurotechnologies are proposed to be able to measure students' attention and engagement. So it's been reported, for example, that certain EEG patterns might predict children's learning success, since different attention brain mechanisms may underlie educational achievement. Now, the implication of measuring student attention then is proposals for new kinds of neurotechnology learning systems for enhanced learning engagement. And one such proposal is for what's been called neuroadaptive learning systems that would combine portable brain scanners with artificial intelligence software to deliver more engaging educational experiences which are based on a kind of readout of students' engagement with the content that they're being presented with. Other ideas include using wearable headsets that could monitor students for lapses of attention and then deliver a short electrical nudge. One example of a kind of a little something that gives a little nudge, a haptic buzz behind the ear, which would prompt or stimulate better in engagement. So, it's a bit more kind of disciplinary in that sense, kind of, about classroom control and behavior control through neurotechnology. So we've called this attentional neurogovernance, by which we're referring to kind of interventions which deploy neurotechnologies to monitor, potentially adapt to, stimulate, or maybe even discipline the learning brain for enhanced attention. And the final form I want to mention here is neurocomputation, and the idea of a kind of neurocomputational learning brain. So in this kind of brand of educational neuroscience research, the learning brain, as we can understand it, this material is very, very difficult to get to grips with for a non-expert. But the learning brain is examined and understood in terms of what's variously described as connectomics and neural networks and similar terms. And it involves laboratory work that includes artificial neural network algorithms and artificial intelligence for brain mapping, for neural simulations, and various forms of brain modeling. And these various forms of neurocomputation have been used to model education-relevant cognitive abilities, including the development of reading, numerical cognition, executive function, and reward-based behaviors. And the main concern in most of these studies appears to be producing computational models of the neural wiring that's associated with learning and cognition, and then simulating future wiring probabilities from imaging data, and using those future wiring probabilities as the basis for specifying some kind of targeted intervention. So we've kind of tentatively called this a form of prospective probabilistic neurogovernance, where the emphasis is on brain models and simulations that appear to be able to predict probable future brain wiring based on estimates from current neuroimaging. And then the idea is that you might be able to intervene preemptively to improve some aspect of brain organization that's associated with academic achievement. And the idea here is that, again, you might use artificial intelligence as a pedagogical device in the classroom to achieve that aim. So I know I've gone over this quite quickly and briefly, but each of these accounts of what a brain or what a learning brain kind of is has different potentials in terms of neurogovernance, how you measure, monitor, model the learning brain, how you look, make it visible through different kinds of neurotechnologies and different methodologies and so on, ends up often leading to different kinds of ideas about how you would kind of act on the brain, or what we refer to as neurogovernance in classroom settings. Now, in this last part of the talk, I just want to sketch out then some of the ways in which educational neuroscience is now seeking to exert some influence on policy and practice. If the idea is that you can take the insights from neurotechnologies and make proposals for what that would mean for classroom practice, then how is educational neuroscience trying to make that happen beyond its kind of laboratory work? Now, there's the effort to make educational neuroscience go to school, goes back several decades, of course, and many of you will, I'm sure, know the bridge too far debate of the mid to late 1990s. But neurotechnology is now seen as precisely the kind of bridging mechanism that will allow brain science insights to be translated into classroom practices. So this is all about how educational neuroscience goes about the sort of the translational work of knowledge brokering. Now, here's a familiar name. In one of the papers we did, we looked at a variety of different kinds of knowledge brokering and translation that's going on. And I believe I was invited to talk today because in one of our papers, we actually highlighted Learnus as one of the examples. And so we think Learnus is a really good example of what we've called coalition building, a particular form of translational knowledge brokering that involves building networks of neuroscientists, educational researchers, education leaders, and teachers, and to influence teacher training and practice by promoting neuroscientific knowledge on education in a variety of formats. So as Richard said at the beginning, this is about dedicated to bringing educators and those who specialize in the study of the brain, the mind, and behavior together in order to use the insights from high quality research to improve and enrich learning for all. So as a kind of knowledge brokering organization, Learners constructs relations between neuroscience and education leaders. It focuses on presenting compelling and persuasive evidence from cutting edge brain science, evidence that's often itself produced with state-of-the-art neurotechnologies. And it positions teachers as beneficiaries of this kind of brain or neuroscientific expertise, which can be gained through training workshops or professional development programs or late afternoon webinars. Now, school partnerships, a second form of knowledge brokering, go further by bringing neuroscience and neurotechnologies directly into schools and classrooms. And one example that we looked at is the Brainwaves Learning Center at Synapse School in California, a partnership with Stanford University Graduate School of Education, with a stated mission of building deep relationships between cognitive neuroscience researchers and the school community to explore how brain activity is transformed through learning experiences and how those insights can in turn enrich education. Now, in practice, what this means is that the Brainwave Learning Center has set up a neurotechnology studio within the school. They call it a brainwave recording studio. And in that studio, they're able to track students' brainwaves, both in short, real time, and also longitudinally, through a suite of wearable neuro headsets and neurotechnology software that's able to analyze and study and generate insights from this kind of real world live use of neurotechnologies in the classroom. This is about, the Brainwaves Learning Center's director has said this is about transforming the minds and brains of the future. So it's not just studying the brain in situ, it's about trying to shape the brain of the learner. Now, sometimes these kind of partnerships lean on commercial organizations, and commercialization is a third form of kind of brokering activity that we've studied. And one example is this company BrainCo that some may have heard of. It was established as a startup. It was incubated by Harvard University and released this wearable neuro headset called Focus Edu about 10 years ago now. And this kind of science fiction marketing of students with these kind of brain sensors strapped to their heads got it quite a lot of press attention. It turned out that the company was running live trials in schools in China and the US. And according to some reports, this meant that BrainCo collected the brain data of tens of thousands of students for the commercial development of better brain analytics and artificial intelligence-based brain models. So it got a lot of negative attention at the time for this kind of activity. But it was recently revealed that this company is now worth well over $1 billion, and there's been significant investment in it by the Chinese state. So these kinds of commercial projects operate in a slightly different way. They don't partner with schools, they try to sell to schools. They present neurotechnologies as capable of kind of maybe even superseding the human capacities of teachers. They propose that teachers expertise would benefit from being supplemented, if not entirely supplanted, by sort of technologies that are presented as capable of interacting directly with learners' brains. And then finally, we have policy influencing as a kind of brokerage, which refers to the translational efforts of international organizations like the OECD and UNESCO to kind of shape the policy relevance of neuroscience in education. So recently, for example, UNESCO's International Bureau of Education launched a book explicitly focused on translating neuroscience into teaching practice. How can we bridge the gap between what science tells us about learning and what happens in classrooms every day? It asked. The IBE has been working to close this gap. Through its Science of Learning Knowledge Brokerage initiative, it translates cutting-edge research into practical, credible knowledge that can inform policy, improve teaching, and enhance learning. So we can see these kinds of efforts as having the explicit intent to make neuroscience, often derived from state-of-the-art neurotechnologies, into a kind of policy-relevant source of school transformation, of learning enhancement, and teacher reprofessionalization. Now, I suppose that the clearest example for us, which we learned about only just after we'd finished up the last of our work, the clearest example that all of this effort is actually animating significant policy interest is this announcement from the Department for Education about setting up a £3 million educational neuroscience research centre to produce high quality, timely, policy relevant evidence on issues such as brain development, learning processes, mental health, and special educational needs, how this impacts pedagogy, and what it means for department policy. So it looks to us like state-of-the-art educational neuroscience, much of it produced and made possible by advances in neurotechnology, is about to become embedded in our policy processes, much more so than I think we've ever seen before. And from the perspective of someone like me who studies education and technology and policy and governance, this is a really sort of fascinating case that I look forward to following and learning about more. Now, I'm aware that I'm more or less out of time, so just to try to wrap up, what I was really hoping to do in this talk was to begin to unpack some of the ways in which educational neuroscience is becoming kind of increasingly authoritative and influential as a source for educational policy and practice. And that may seem obvious to most of you who work within learners, but for those of us working in the social sciences, this is really interesting, sometimes quite concerning set of developments to observe how a particular kind of high-tech data-intensive science is now beginning to generate significant policy interest through its kind of claims about how we now understand the learning brain, and that informs how we think about how we might act on it through classroom practices. What I've tried to urge is a little caution about what sometimes seem to be very, very kind of grand claims about the novelty and the importance and the salience of educational neuroscience. I want to try to draw attention to the way in which actually all sciences are always mediated through social processes, social practices, through technologies, through instruments, through a variety of choices. That means that what we take to be brain facts need to be seen as kind of achievements. These are accomplishments of certain neuroscientists and technologies at a certain time in a certain place. However, we clearly are in a position now where this idea of the learning brain has, really has become an object of policy fascination and attention, and also growing interest amongst teachers as well. Now, from a social science perspective, there is some concern about whether this represents a particular kind of biologization of learning, which perhaps bypasses consideration of some of the enduring social factors that shape how students learn and the outcomes they achieve, or that recognizes social factors, but then investigates those through seeing their kind of neurobiological impacts, back inside of the skull. I think there may be much benefit in trying to have better conversations between social scientists and the humanities and neuroscientists to properly better understand the role of these new neurotechnologies in shaping educational policy and practice. And I hope these kinds of conversations between the social and neurosciences aren't considered a bridge too far. Thank you very much again for the invitation and for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was absolutely fascinating. Yeah, uh, I really appreciate that different perspective on it. It's almost you're saying the science of the methodology of the science, we can't ignore the impact that has on the conclusions that are drawn. So, in that case, in your study of the data that's been generated by all this neurotechnology, how reliable do you think that model is that we've derived from this neurotechnology?
Yeah, I mean, we tried to be really careful in our papers to avoid the idea that we were directly criticizing educational neuroscience. But what we were trying to bring in is, I suppose, a particular line of critique, which, as you said, draws attention to um, the fact that no kind of science can ever be considered a wholly kind of objective. We don't have some kind of fully objective, neutral understanding. Everything is, at least in part, a kind of a construct of the that results from decisions about what kinds of methods to employ and what kinds of technologies to use. Um, and neurotechnologies clearly are now helping neuroscientists to look at the brain in new ways. It's changing the way we understand the brain and solidifying some particular arguments and views about what a brain is and does. So we were not trying to suggest that any of that is wrong. What we were trying to do is highlight what actually happens when some of these neurotechnologies are used. What are the conclusions then that scientists come to? And how does that lead to particular ideas about what you could or even should do in schools or in classroom settings? Like, there's no way you could have done a hyperscanning study 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
These are the sorts of things that have really only become possible in the last decade or so. And that leads to what I hope we've begun to indicate is, very different ideas about what's happening in classrooms, and understanding now that what happens in classrooms is what is called, interbrain synchrony. And that then is leading to particular ideas about what we should do in classrooms to enhance the kind of the learning achievements of all. So it was that kind of critique rather than a criticism of the particular models that we were hoping to at least bring here.
I remember doing a talk with Michael Thomas. Is teaching an art or a science was my argument, and yeah, that's kind of so. But
Yeah,
I love the thing about the wearable technology that acts as a cattle prod when kids lack attention. That's just mind-bogglingly awful, isn't it? Anyway, how much of the brain is monitored by the devices? The final commercial picture showed those little headbands, and Ginny is
yeah,
asking how much of the brain is monitored by the devices. They look fairly restricted.
yeah. So all of these kinds of head-worn devices, they're almost exclusively EEG. So the fidelity is relatively low because obviously you can't capture much from non-invasive devices like this. What they claim to be able to capture are particular kind of brainwave oscillations that are indicators of or proxies of things that are understood to be related to learning in some way. So there are particular so-called kind of indicators of things like attention or mind wandering.
Mm.
Yeah, so I don't know. There are particular kind of oscillations and bands that are associated with different things like your mind is wandering, your brain waves will indicate, what one will on one particular band. If you're highly concentrated, your brain waves will look somewhat different. So I think we're talking about that kind of level of data collection. We're definitely not talking about collecting thoughts here. We're talking about collecting proxies, indicators, often quite noisy signals.
Yeah.
Um, and often I guess certainly from some of the things we've read, there's a kind of assumption that somehow the magic of data analytics or even artificial intelligence is able to make sense and clean up that noisy data to turn it into some kind of reliable signal. So how much of the brain is monitored? Very, very little. Nonetheless, particularly a lot of the commercial manufacturers are operating on the basis that these technologies give us enough kind
Yeah.
of proxy indicators that they could be used as the basis for action. However, kind of problematic some of the assumptions underlying the tech might actually be.
Yeah, absolutely. Derek's asking, how do we include teachers and students in this conversation?
Great question. And I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I try to involve some of my own students in the conversation by exposing them to some of this stuff. Um, normally when I show them the brain co head sensors, they're all a little bit despairing. Although I do teach quite a lot of students from the Chinese context, and for them, the idea of kind of various sorts of sensors in classrooms is actually a bit more normalized.
Yeah.
So the idea of not necessarily so much the brain or sort of cerebral surveillance, but a lot of kind of facial emotion recognition and so on. I'd love to know about how we better bring in teachers and students into these kinds of conversations. I hope that maybe organizations like Learnus might be able to reach teachers with an interest in particularly the brain or the
Yeah.
neuro and the cognitive sciences. So that might be one mechanism. It's partly why I kind of said at the end that I'm hopeful there might be some way of sort of brokering better relations between the kind of the cognitive and the neurosciences, and more broadly, I suppose, the sciences of learning and social sciences. I think we have a different perspective on things that I
Mm.
hope we might be able to bring, but we don't necessarily have the good contact with the teachers and the students. But great question, and I think a really important thing for us to pursue more.
Kendra's asking, it's so interesting to hear about science itself as the object of study. What do you think should happen in the relationship between education and neuroscience, and what can organizations like Learners do,
Mm.
other than what we're already doing?
I mean, maybe. I mean, yeah. So particularly, some of my colleagues are very much part of this field of kind of science and technology studies or sociology of science, which really does, looks at science as an object of study or methods as an object of study or kind of scientific instruments and technologies as objects of study. So there are, huge numbers of people who do that. I think what can we do better? I think probably having honest conversations about some of the limits of the kind of
Yeah,
technologies, instruments,
yeah,
and methodologies, amongst the kinds of communities that Learners brings together. amongst those of us who are perhaps coming from a bit more of an outsider perspective, and acknowledging that we're at a particular moment where there is a huge push for these neurotechnologies. They're being taken up in lab studies. They're also being commercialized. And frankly, if you're doing a lab study based on neurotechnologies, you rely on the commercial neurotech industry.
Yeah.
These two things can't be properly teased apart. So let's perhaps think about, is there the possibility of having conversations about the significance, the risks, the dangers of these kinds of technologies? What does it really mean to use brain sensors of a variety of kinds that can collect what are potentially the most sensitive of data, things that is or at least indicators or proxies of private thoughts and so on? There's a whole kind of little sector of people now working in neuroethics in relation to neurotechnologies. I was at a session just at lunchtime today, which is neuroethicists. Most of their attention is taken up with the big spectacular cases like Elon Musk's Neuralink, right? So all the neuroethicists are really concerned about that kind of stuff, or even about the more kind of commercial applications. What's much less in the gaze of the neuroethicists at the moment are the ways in which these kind of technologies are being taken up in sectors like ours, in education or in social care and things like that. So I think, what could we do better? Let's have the conversations about what these technologies mean, their risks, their dangers, and whether we need to do anything further about them. Maybe that would be a start, Kendra.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got a question here from Yeji. As educator and student researcher who is not a scientist, what do I have to do first when doing research in this field of educational neuroscience?
I'm not quite sure whether you mean you're a kind of junior educational neuroscientist or somebody who's kind of studying it from the outside.
As an educator and student researcher who is not a scientist.
Okay. And what do they have to do to?
First, when doing research in this field, so yeah, of educational neuroscience.
Yeah.
So it's the introduction, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of introductory texts.
Yeah.
I mean, Richard, you already mentioned the work of Michael Thomas.
Yeah.
has a number of good kind of introductory work, and there are others. I mean, if you really want to, I mean, the two papers that I shared on the slide, both of them give a little bit of an overview of, what does the latest literature say about the role of neurotechnology in education. That might be a start if you're interested. I mean, we come at it from a particular perspective, but we do try to engage with the actual literature from educational neuroscience in its own terms.
Yeah. What are the models and AI analysis trying to replicate? The brainwaves measured seem to be very vague.
So they're trying to replicate, well, things like attention and engagement. Some of the other, I mentioned the kind of more computational approach, it's trying to capture whole brain connectivity and then identify, this is the notion of connectomics, that everything's connected. And then they're trying to identify, which wiring kind of, what would be the term? Kind of wiring networks or clusters and so on are then associated with particular kinds of academic achievements or outcomes and so on. So that kind of neurocomputational stuff and the connectomics model seems to us to be a much more advanced, much more sophisticated version of what is happening with the kind of, the almost consumer type neuro headsets, which are pretty low in terms of accuracy and fidelity and so on. I suspect that more neurocomputational stuff will continue to rely for some time on the much more cumbersome, heavy, expensive kind of like massive kind of laboratory technologies. But it seems to me that kind of work is sort of perhaps generating slightly more sophisticated models than the much more kind of limited stuff that you get from consumer grade, which is not to say that we shouldn't also interrogate and try to understand better exactly what those kinds of connectomics neurocomputational technologies are also doing and think about some of their limits and so on. But they're obviously or seem to be working at a different level to the things that you can just buy off Amazon.
Okay. Okay. And then finally, I think, Ben, in your research, did you come across the possible increased use of smart drugs?
Um, yeah, we didn't, and we didn't look at it. We didn't look for it, and I mean, I have read some stuff about sort of smart drugs. It's part of all of smart pharmaceuticals, brain technologies. These are all part of a kind of a logic of technological enhancement of the learner of
Yeah.
varieties of kinds, some of which is properly pseudoscientific, some of which is based on work that's a bit more sort of valid and credible. I yeah, so I haven't looked specifically at the smart drugs, but
Okay.
I have heard indications that their use is increasing. But like I
So,
say, it's all part of this idea that you can enhance yourself, enhance your brain, enhance your productivity, enhance your outcomes.
yeah. Hmm. Well, that remains to be seen.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
exactly. I mean, I think
yeah.
much of this is kind of the promises of hype and promises of self-enhancement often rest on hype and marketing
Yeah.
as much as anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks ever so much for that, Ben. I found that absolutely fascinating. And I hope the rest of the people who were with us tonight did as well. We will be posting, obviously, after the talk. So you don't need to worry if you came in late or anything. But yeah, thanks ever so much. That has really given me a new dimension for thinking about this whole area because we've struggled so long to get attention on educational neuroscience and move it away perhaps from some of the educational psychology which has dominated education practice for so long.
Mm,
But you are absolutely right. There are massive risks in getting carried away in models that are analogies,
mm.
and yes. So very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you again for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure to meet you all tonight.
Thank you. Good
Take care,
night,
everyone.
everybody.